Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. What I'm going to speak about today is this book that I wrote, which is The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. And basically, the story I'm going to tell you is that when the Cold War ended, the United States adopted a foreign policy called liberal hegemony. And the basic goal of that foreign policy was to remake the world in America's image. That policy was a colossal failure. And it's one of the principal reasons that Donald Trump is in the White House today. And I'll talk more about that at the end of my talk. Very important to understand that Donald Trump ran hook, line, and sinker against liberal hegemony. And what I want to do is describe this policy. I want to tell you what the proponents of the policy thought the benefits were, why we pursued liberal hegemony at that particular juncture in time, i.e. the end of the Cold War. I want to tell you about some of the policy issues involved around it, and then explain to you why it failed. And then I'll wrap up by talking about the future. So that's the basic architecture of my talk today. This is all about liberal hegemony. It's all about American foreign policy during the unipolar moment. Now, what exactly is liberal hegemony? As I said a minute ago, liberal hegemony is all about remaking the world in America's image. That has three dimensions to it. The first of which is to promote liberal democracy across the planet, to go to great lengths to make every country on the planet a liberal democracy, to make it look like the United States of America. So that's the first goal. The second goal is to embed every state, and especially those big states like China and Russia, in that international economic order that the United States was principally responsible for creating during the Cold War. In other words, you want to get everybody hooked on capitalism. You want a lot of economic interdependence in the system. So that's the second goal. Again, the first goal is to promote liberal democracy. Second is to embed countries in the international economic order that Uncle Sugar created during the Cold War. And then the third goal, which is related to the second, is to get countries embedded in international institutions. For example, you want to get China embedded in the World Trade Organization. You want to get Russia into the IMF and the World Bank. You want to get more and more countries into NATO and the European Union, which are international institutions. So these are the three principal goals, and it's easy to understand how a country like the United States would pursue these particular missions. So that's really what liberal hegemony was all about. Now, the second question you want to ask yourself is, what were the benefits of this? In other words, why was Uncle Sam pushing so hard to remake the world in America's image? Well, we thought there were three major benefits. The first has to do with human rights. As you all know, because Canada is a thoroughly liberal country, much like the United States, liberals care greatly about individual rights. And this is a wonderful thing. It's one of the reasons that I'm very thankful that I was born and raised in liberal America. Okay? So we care about rights, and we believe those rights are inalienable. And what that means is that every person on the planet has those rights, and that we as Americans and we as Canadians care not only about the rights of our fellow Americans or our fellow Canadians, we care about the rights of everybody on the planet. Rights really matter. They're a centerpiece of liberal theory. And the idea here is that if you can create a planet that's filled with nothing but liberal democracies, we will no longer have to worry about massive violations of human rights, because liberal democracies, by definition, privilege individual rights and hardly ever engage in massive violations of those rights. So again, liberal hegemony is holding out the promise of effectively eliminating the problem of massive rights violations. That's the first benefit. What's the second benefit? The second benefit, which all of the students in the audience will know right away, is democratic peace theory. This is the idea that liberal democracies do not fight against each other. Well, if liberal democracies do not fight against each other, which liberal hegemonists believe to the core, I'm sure many Canadians believe to the core. If you believe that, then if you create a planet that has nothing but liberal democracies on it, you have love, peace, and dope. What else can you have? There's going to be no more war. You all know Frank Fukuyama's very famous piece, The End of History, right? The End of History, right, says that what's happening here is that liberal democracy is inexorably spreading all across the planet. And we're eventually going to reach the point, Frank says, where there's nothing but liberal democracies on the planet. And what does he say is then going to be the most formidable problem we face? Boredom. Boredom. Why? Because nobody fights against each other. There are no massive violations of human rights. So you can see where if you have a country like the United States, right, that's a thoroughly liberal country, that it's going to think that spreading liberal democracy is a really good thing, because it's going to bring peace to the world and eliminate human rights violations. The third reason that, or the third benefit that we think you're going to get from liberal hegemony is it's going to make the world safe for democracy, for liberal democracy. It's very important to understand that liberal democracies are very skittish about their future. They worry about internal threats and they worry about external threats. When I was a little boy growing up in the United States of America, we, meaning Americans, the American government, worried about communists. We really worried about communists. We worried about the American Communist Party forming an alliance with Moscow. Well, if you have a world where there's nothing but liberal democracies, you don't have to worry about your Communist Party forming an alliance with Moscow, because there's no Moscow that's communist that's out there. It's a liberal democracy too. So for the purposes of maintaining your liberal democracy forever and ever, to use Woodrow Wilson's term, for purposes of making the world safe for democracy, what you want is a planet that has nothing but liberal democracies on it. So this was our goal, right? To make the world a place that had nothing but liberal democracies, because it would give us these three major benefits. Now, the next question you want to ask yourself is, why didn't we do this in 1980 or in 1920? Why did we do it in the post-Cold War period? Right? Why is liberal hegemony, in my story, peculiar to unipolarity? And there are three factors you want to keep in mind here. First, and this is a general point you should all keep in your frontal lobes over the years moving forward. What's going on in the world today is that the glacis plates are moving. We're going from unipolarity to multipolarity. And when many of us in the room, I'm talking here about the old dogs, when we were young, we grew up in a bipolar world, and the glacis plates shifted in the late 80s, early 90s, and we went from bipolarity to unipolarity. So in my lifetime, we've gone from bipolarity to unipolarity, and we're now going to multipolarity. All of those of you who are trying to make sense of what's going on in the world today, and you can't figure out what's happening, a large part of the story is that the glacis plates are moving. and all sorts of adjustments are being made. There are all sorts of consequences from this. But anyway, we went, when the Cold War ended, from bipolarity to unipolarity. Now, why does this matter for liberal hegemony? The fact is, if you live in a bipolar world, you have the US and the Soviet Union, those two countries are going to behave towards each other in a realist fashion. Balance of power politics is going to dominate relations between the United States and the Soviet Union. But when you move to a unipolar world, you have, by definition, only one great power. So you can no longer have great power politics. All of this is a way of saying that the unipole, or the sole pole, which is the United States of America, does not have to worry about balance of power politics because there are no other great powers in the system. And just to get way ahead of myself, you understand what's happening now is we're moving out of unipolarity to multipolarity, i.e. balance of power politics is coming back. But that's getting way ahead of myself. The point is, in the early 1990s, we were moving squarely into a unipolar world, especially after December 1991 when the Soviet Union went down the toilet bowl, right? So we were in a unipolar world where we did not have to worry about balance of power politics. All of that's another way of saying we were free to pursue an ideological foreign policy in ways we were not free to do before 1989. So that's the first enabling condition. The second, enabling condition is that the United States is a thoroughly liberal country. We are wired that way. It's in our DNA. So you take a really unusual situation where the United States doesn't have to worry about balance of power politics, and it's free to pursue an ideological foreign policy, and it's a highly ideological state, i.e. it's a crusader state. You all understand the United States is a crusader state. Canada, by the way, would be a crusader state if it was powerful enough, right? Because you believe in liberal hegemony just like we do, right? It's just that we happen to be really powerful. So the second condition is you have this highly ideological state, right, that is the unipole. Then the third reason that we did this is we thought it was going to be easy. Some of you in the room are old enough to remember the optimism that existed in the early 1990s. We thought we meaning the Americans and Canadians and West Europeans, we thought we had the wind at our back. And this is what Frank Fukuyama told us. Frank told us that the world is eventually going to be filled with liberal democracies. What the United States had done in the first half of the 20th century is it had defeated fascism. In the second half of the 20th century, we defeated communism. And there was only one viable political order left, liberal democracy. And it was slowly but steadily spread across the planet. And therefore, we had the wind at our back. So here you have this highly ideological unipole, also known as a crusader state, right, that has the wind at its back. And we're off to the races. So this is how it all got started. So, the question is, what happened? There are three big policies worth talking about here that really illustrate liberal hegemony at play. One is the Bush Doctrine, which has mainly to do with the Middle East. Two is Ukraine and the crisis with Russia over Ukraine. And number three is engagement with China. These are three of the colossal failures from liberal hegemony's run during the unipolar moment. Let me start with the Bush Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine was all about turning the Middle East, the greater Middle East, into a sea of liberal democracies. The United States believed that it could make Afghanistan a liberal democracy, it could make Iraq a liberal democracy, And we would live happily ever after because we would have peace for the first time in the Middle East, because as you all know, liberal democracies never fight each other. And we'd have no human rights violations in the Middle East. When I make this argument, people say, John, I don't remember us going into Iraq for purposes of spreading liberal democracy. We went in there to deal with two problems: proliferation and terrorism. And I said, yes, we did go into the Middle East to deal with those twin problems of proliferation and terrorism. But the way we thought we would deal with those problems was to create a sea of democracies. Because once you create a sea of democracies, conflict is taken off the table. You don't need nuclear weapons. Nuclear proliferation goes away, and liberal democracies don't engage in terrorism. This is the story that you tell yourself. So when we went into Afghanistan and we won what appeared to be a stunning military victory between October of 2001 and December 2001, and then we put Hamid Karzai in power in Kabul, we thought we had laid the foundation for liberal democracy. The Taliban had been routed. We got out of town, and we reloaded the shotgun to go into Iraq. And you might not believe this, you young people in the audience today, but Iraq was not the last stop on the train line. We thought we were going to go in and do in Iraq what we did in Afghanistan. Go in, knock off the government, put Chalabi in place of Saddam Hussein, and then march on to the next target. Very important to understand that. When the Israelis caught wind in early 2002, remember, we have won, quote unquote, in Afghanistan by December 2001. When the Israelis catch wind in early 2002 that we're thinking of doing Iraq next, they send a high-level delegation to the United States and say, are you crazy? You should be doing Iran next, because Iran is the real threat. This makes perfect sense if you read the newspapers every day. What does the administration, the Bush administration, and their neoconservative allies on the outside tell the Israelis? Relax. Iraq is the low-hanging fruit. We're going to deal with Iraq first, then we'll deal with either Syria or Iran next, and we might not even have to deal with Iran, because Iran will throw its hands up and surrender, knowing that we're on the march, that the Crusader state is capable of knocking off regimes here, there, and everywhere and turning them into liberal democracies. This is what the Bush Doctrine was all about. Of course, it failed, so people don't talk much about this now, but that's what they were thinking now. There was a real sense of optimism in the United States, right?
Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
We're gonna kick some Iraqi ass!
What did you say?
We're gonna kick some Iraqi ass, son!
Oh, hell, son. What, are you gonna win the Medal of Honor all by yourself? What's the rest of my battalion gonna do?
Kick some Iraqi ass!
You know, I think it's time for me to retire. I can't hear a fucking thing!
Kick some Iraqi ass!
Oh, boys, I just got a heart on.
But anyway, we gave up on invading countries after Iraq, but we still have been interfering and causing all sorts of trouble. Syria, in the United States, they like to say, the United States has had hardly anything to do with what happened in Syria. This is nonsense. The United States is deeply involved in Syria. We were funding and training rebels. We worked with the Qataris, the Saudis, and the Turks to help overthrow Assad. We bear a huge amount of responsibility for that giant mess. Libya, we all know what we did there. We told Colonel Gaddafi, give up your WMD programs and we'll leave you alone. He gave up his WMD programs. You know where he is now? 6 feet under. And you know who helped put him 6 feet under? Uncle Sugar did. Right? That's what happened here. The amount of murder and mayhem in the Middle East, the greater Middle East, that we're responsible for is truly remarkable. Just truly remarkable. The Bush Doctrine was a colossal failure. Our policies in the greater Middle East were a colossal failure. If there was any accountability in our system, most of those policymakers would be in the gulag. That's the Bush Doctrine.
Listen, we use these cars to fight Saddam's soldiers.
Cannot take.
George Bush wants you.
George Bush?
wants you.
You
wants you.
Yes!
He wants everybody.
To
fight for freedom on your own. Then America will follow. God bless America, and God bless a free Iraq. Now, what do you say, my friend?
Cannot give car.
Okay, I guess we'll buy them.
Then there's Ukraine. In this case, the argument in the United States and in Western Europe, and I'm sure it's true up here in Canada among most people, is that the Russians are principally responsible for the Ukraine crisis. And by the way, it was lucky that we were expanding NATO eastward, because what happened in the Ukraine crisis shows you that the Russians were highly aggressive, and therefore we anticipated that problem smartly, and we've solved it. This argument bears little resemblance to reality, right? The West is principally responsible for this crisis. And basically what happened here is that we didn't simply move NATO eastward, we moved the EU eastward as well, and we fomented the color revolutions. You've all heard of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and we were even threatening to foment a color revolution in Moscow itself. Now, what's going on here? What we're doing is we're taking liberal hegemony and we are moving it eastward in Europe. What we're doing is, number one, trying to spread liberal democracy. That's the first goal of liberal hegemony. We're trying to spread liberal democracy in Eastern Europe. Think the color revolutions. Second goal is to get these countries hooked on capitalism, get them integrated into the international economic order that Uncle Sam created. What do you think EU expansion is all about? The third goal is to get these countries integrated into international institutions. Think the EU, think NATO. So the basic goal here was not to contain Russia. Michael McFaul, who was the American ambassador to Moscow, will tell you that he told Putin that NATO expansion was not aimed at containing Russia. And I believe that was true. It was part of a policy of liberal hegemony, which was to make Eastern Europe up to the Russian border look like Western Europe, to make countries like Ukraine and Georgia a bulwark on Russia's borders, right? Liberal democratic bulwarks, right? And there was even talk that maybe eventually Russia would become part of this liberal international order. Well, do you think the Russians were going to tolerate this? The Russians were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion from the very beginning. They opposed the 1999 expansion, which included countries like Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary. They opposed the 2004 expansion, and then the big mistake was made in Bucharest in April 2008 at the NATO summit, where when the summit concluded, a communique was released by NATO, which said that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. And the Russians said, that is not happening. It's no accident, ladies and gentlemen, that in August of 2008, there was a war over Georgia, and it's no accident that in February 2014, a war broke out over Ukraine. The Russians have absolutely no intention of letting either Georgia or Ukraine become part of NATO. And as you can understand, the Russians don't like the idea of a color revolution in Moscow. And I'll talk more about this in a minute. But we, with NATO expansion, EU expansion, and the color revolutions, went a bridge too far. And this all blew up in our face. And now the United States, which needs the Russians to deal with Iran, needs the Russians to deal with China, has pushed the Russians into the arms of the Chinese and pushed the Russians into the arms of the Ukrainians. The Iranians. But the idea that the Russians caused this, that they were poised to take over Ukraine, there's no evidence to support it. It was all a reaction to Western policies. And then finally we get to engagement with China. This is the biggest blunder of all, right? The basic goal here is to get China hooked on capitalism, to make China really rich, get it into the WTO, which we finally accomplished in 2001, then let the Chinese violate a lot of the important rules in the WTO, get richer and richer. That's the second goal. Third goal is embed them in institutions, which we're doing, get them in the WTO. And then the belief is that once you do that, they will become a liberal democracy. The richer you make them, the more likely it is they'll become a liberal democracy. And once they become a liberal democracy, they're hooked on capitalism, and they're rule-abiding citizens because they're in all these international institutions, which are really all about rules. They will become what Robert Zellick famously called a responsible stakeholder. That one worked out really well, didn't it? Xi Jinping, he looks like a paradigmatic liberal Democrat, doesn't he? It looks good. Looks real good. That's a colossal failure. Read Kurt Campbell's piece in Foreign Affairs. He was one of the principal architects of that remarkably foolish policy, who now admits it was wrong. But what's the end result of that? We helped grow a country that is a potential peer competitor. We are up to our eyeballs in alligators and thinking about how to deal with this country, which has 4 times as many people as us and is growing economically at a rapid pace. This is a potential peer competitor. From the American point of view, this is the worst possible outcome. And we helped create it. And many Chinese will tell you behind closed door that they were amazed at the time that we were feeding the beast. They couldn't understand what we were doing from our own point of view. It's very simple, liberal hegemony. So the question is, what went wrong here? And as some of you know, my argument is that nationalism trumps liberalism and realism trumps liberalism. And what happened here is that liberalism ran into 2 different buzzsaws. One was nationalism and the other is realism. And let me just take a few minutes to lay this out for you. Let's just talk about the Bush Doctrine. The idea that the United States can invade countries and do social engineering in those countries, especially at the end of a rifle barrel, in the age of nationalism, is foolish in the extreme. Nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And it's very clear that if you invade a country like Iraq or Afghanistan, you are eventually going to go from being a liberator to being an occupier. And once you become an occupier, nationalism kicks in, and there's tremendous resistance from the people who live in this country. I learned this when I was a young boy/man when I was in the American military. I was in the American military from 1965 to 1975, which was coterminous with the Vietnam War. Marines landed at Da Nang on March 8th, 1965. I went into the Army as an enlisted man on June 22nd, 1965. I got out of the American military in August of 1975. The Vietnam War ended in the spring of 1975. And one thing I learned during those years is that we were not fighting communism in Vietnam. The reason that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong fought like wild dogs against us was not because of communism, it was because of nationalism. They didn't want a bunch of Europeans when the French were there telling them what colored toilet paper they could use, and they didn't want us telling them what colored toilet paper they could use. They wanted to run their own politics. Right. I remember in 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, everybody said, "Oh my God, this is the end of the world. The Soviets are on the march." I said exactly the opposite. The Soviet Union has just created a huge blunder. They've just invaded a country in the developing world where they're soon going to be seen as an occupier, and they're going to be up to their eyeballs dealing with resistance. You want to stay out of places like Afghanistan if you're the Soviet Union or if you're the United States of America. My view is if you're arms racing or you're in a security competition with another great power, what you want to do is encourage that great power to intervene in places like Afghanistan and Vietnam. When I first started going to China in the early 2000s, I told the Chinese, tongue-in-cheek of course, but I said, what you want to do is tell the Americans that they have to win the war on terror. You're counting on them to win the war on terror, and they have to stay in Afghanistan and in Iraq until they win. I said, they'll be there forever, wrecking their military, wrecking their economy, right? You want to stay out of those places, right? This is why I oppose the Iraq War. Brian referenced that. Steve Walt and I and all the realists, because the realists appreciate the importance of nationalism, most powerful political ideology on the planet. Let's talk about the Russians and the Chinese. You don't think that Vladimir Putin got really upset at the idea that we were doing social engineering in Moscow? That Michael McFaul was going to be active with groups that were interested in turning? Michael McFaul was the ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. You don't think the Russians and Putin in particular were going to be very upset about the fact that we were trying to tinker with the Russian political system? You all follow American politics. You know how ballistic the United States goes at the mere thought that the Russians are interfering in our politics. You know what that is? That's American nationalism. Nationalism is all about sovereignty. We are a sovereign state. We do not like the idea of the Russians meddling in our politics. Well, as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we don't like the Russians interfering in our politics, are you surprised that they didn't like us interfering in their politics? That's nationalism. Go to Beijing. Ask the Chinese what they think about us interfering over issues like protests in Hong Kong. They do not think for 1 second that we have a right to interfere and with what's going on in Hong Kong. You all follow this story for sure about the Houston Rockets general manager who tweeted in support of those protesters in Hong Kong. He got himself into a whole heck of a lot of trouble. Why? Nationalism. Go to China today. Boy, the nationalism is really powerful. All of this is to say, in a world where nationalism is really powerful, if you're a crusader state and you're sticking your nose in everybody else's business, and especially if you're trying to occupy one of those countries, you are going to get yourself in a whole heap of lot of trouble. And what you want to do, again, is you want to stay out and encourage your adversaries to go in. That's nationalism. Then there's realism. Let's just talk about Ukraine. Does anybody seriously think that you can march NATO right up to Russia's border and turn Ukraine and Georgia into Western bulwarks, and the Russians are just going to sit there and take it? That they're going to understand that we're a benign hegemon? This is not the way international politics works. Just take the United States of America. We have the Monroe Doctrine. Right. The Monroe Doctrine says that no country in the Western Hemisphere is allowed to invite a distant great power into this hemisphere and form a military alliance with it and put military forces in the hemisphere. Do you think the United States, let's hypothesize a situation. It's 20 years from now. China forms a close relationship with Canada and Mexico. They form a military alliance, and the Chinese decide that they're going to deploy some military forces in Canada and in Mexico. You think the United States is going to say, Canada's a sovereign country, Mexico's a sovereign country, and they can do whatever they want? If you believe that, you are really asking for trouble. If you show any interest in forming a military alliance or getting too close to the Chinese, the Americans will be on top of you like nobody's business. You remember there's enough old dogs in this room who remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. Fidel Castro had the audacity to form a military alliance with Cuba, then invite them, to form a military alliance with the Soviet Union, then invite the Soviets to put missiles in Cuba. We still have not recovered from that. You notice that we still have our gun sights on Cuba. Oh, that just drove us crazy. That's a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. Again, you know my rhetoric about what's good for the goose is good for the gander. You're surprised that the Russians were upset about NATO expansion? And it was not just NATO expansion, it was NATO expansion plus EU expansion plus the color revolutions. And you know, a lot of people say to me, don't you understand, John, that Ukraine is a sovereign state and it can choose its own foreign policy? To which my response is, that's a foolish way of thinking about international politics. If you're a small state and you live next door to a guerrilla, you have to be really very careful what you do. Because if you make that guerrilla angry, that guerrilla is going to do all sorts of horrible things to you. And we basically, probably unintentionally, encouraged Ukraine to pursue policies that got into a heap of trouble. And then when they got into a heap of trouble, what did we do? Nothing. We led them down the primrose path. And we did the same thing with Georgia. The Georgians were expecting us to come to the rescue. They're expecting the 7th Cavalry to arrive. It didn't happen. Surprise of surprises. But anyway, all I'd say is you got to understand basic realpolitik here. All right, talk in conclusion about the future. Liberal hegemony is dead. And it's dead for two reasons. One is Donald Trump. It's very important to understand that Donald Trump ran against liberal hegemony. As you all know, he said, we're getting out of the business of spreading liberal democracy around the world. He said that. As you know, he's never met a dictator that he wasn't willing to jump into bed with, and in most cases with enthusiasm. And most of our Democratic allies he's into slapping around, right? With regard to economic interdependence and an open international economy, he likes to refer to himself as Mr. Tariff, right? This is a guy who's not interested in maintaining the open international economic order that the United States created after the Cold War ended. He has a fundamentally different view. Which, with regard to institutions, the guy's never met an institution he doesn't loathe, right? He thinks NATO's obsolete. Some of the EU leaders identify him as public enemy number one when it comes to the EU. He hates the World Trade Organization. He hates the IMF. He hates the World Bank. One of the first things he did, foolishly in my opinion, was to nix the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, when he came to office. As you up here in Canada know, he hated NAFTA. He hates institutions. So he hates institutions. He has no interest in spreading democracy. And he's Mr. Tariff. He ran against liberal hegemony. And he got elected. And why did he get elected? He got elected in part because the policy was bankrupt. The story that I'm telling you about failure after failure is not one I'm making up. Trump recognized that, and he ran against his Republican opponents in the primaries on that platform. He said explicitly that George W. Bush was a failed foreign policy president, and then he ran against Hillary Clinton and the Democrats, and he won. So that's the first reason it's done. But the more important reason that liberal hegemony is done is we're no longer in a unipolar world. In fact, we're now moving into a multipolar world with one, the rise of China, and two, the resurrection of Russian power under Vladimir Putin in the 2000s, roughly over the past 20 years. The Russians are back. The Chinese have grown very powerful. The United States, by the way, is still the most powerful country in the world. I don't want to make light of that. The United States is very powerful. But nevertheless, we're now in a multipolar world. And as I told you at the beginning of my talk, when you are in a multipolar world, the United States has to pay primary attention to balance of power politics. You can't pursue an ideological foreign policy because the balance of power matters so much. So liberal hegemony is out the window for that reason. Let me conclude with just one quick observation. I have very mixed emotions about this. And the reason I have very mixed emotions about this is that we have turned China into a peer competitor. And I believe that from an American point of view, we are now moving into very dangerous waters. I think the United States behaved foolishly during the unipolar moment. And there's no question we did a lot of damage in places like the greater Middle East. But I think the world was far less dangerous in the unipolar moment than it's going to be moving forward, because I think the US-China competition is going to dominate the landscape in the decades ahead. And I think the potential for big trouble on that front is not to be underestimated. And the key point you want to keep in mind is that the individuals who ran American foreign policy during the unipolar moment created this situation by feeding the beast. Thank you.